Good morning. Good morning. I'm not Miss Tamara. I apologize. Miss Tamara took the day off because she's been helping her son, who's going on a tour of colleges, nine schools, I believe, and she needed to rest. So I am stepping in, and it's going to be a little different. And I appreciate y'all being on here. Hey, David, welcome.
Hi, Robby.
Tamara.
What was that?
I'm not Miss Tamara.
No, I noticed.
So it's going to be a little different today. I don't know if you caught the change. So Miss Tamara is taking the day off today because she needs to rest.
Yeah, I heard that. Mm-hmm.
She's helping her son do a tour of colleges. He's going to 9 colleges, and they've been preparing and packing and so on. So it's going to be me, you, and Egberto. And I'm filling in on the fly. So any assistance, as you know, I'm not an experienced broadcaster, but this is going to be interesting nevertheless.
Yeah. We don't have our showrunner.
She's the expert too. So anything you want to bring up just off the cuff happening this week?
Yeah, well, I had a few things that I thought we might have a conversation about. One of them is I have some observations about Black History Month that I think would be appropriate for the month. And the other thing I thought we might discuss between the two of us and with Egberto is this new initiative, the Green New Deal. And I'd really like to talk about some of the ways in which the invoking the New Deal is not a great idea. So, I want to think about these issues of what is the political base, the constituency for the carbon economy. I think that's something we really need to interrogate and think about a lot more than we have, because always the focus is on the big, fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel, corporations that are worth, hundreds of billions and maybe even more than that, and their influence, their lobbying ability, their power in Congress. But we don't think about why there's so much climate denial in the country, and who is it that is denying climate.
Let's take it a step back, David, because I know that Tamara's audience is highly political, and your audience is usually highly political. I'm kind of the layperson here, and I want to make sure that everyone knows what we're talking about.
Sure.
So why don't you give a little bit of the background in terms of what the New Deal is, maybe a little bit of the old deal, a little bit, and who's pushing the New Deal, and then kind of discuss where you're at right now. So the background.
Yes. Okay. So we have a climate crisis. It's becoming increasingly apparent to everybody that that there's something going on in the climate and in the environment that is a radical shift, one that is going to disrupt human civilization. It already is beginning to do that. The wildfires in the West, increasing power of hurricanes, the rising sea levels, all of those things.
This is not the background. So maybe if I question you a little bit, we can get it. So what the New Deal arose, right, out of the name arose out of what was considered the old deal, right? The Green New Deal, the old deal. The
deal was a response to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And when the Democrats took power from the Republicans, had a large majority in the Congress, and passed a lot of legislation to support to pass Social Security, for instance, and the rights of working people and factory workers to organize labor unions. And among other things, one of the last measures was at the end of World War II, the Congress passed a GI Bill, which allowed veterans to get access to college education, home loans, and also small business loans. So it is invoked usually by the Democrats to say that this was a massive government extension of the social safety net to working people. All right, that's the old.
Thank you for giving background. Perfect. That's actually really, really helpful. Literally having you on the show is like having an encyclopedia who can explain it. So you have a different version or viewpoint in terms of the consequences of what the New Deal did and intentions, which you just described. So what are some of the consequences that maybe...
Let's talk about the Green New Deal first. Let's talk about so the Green New Deal is an initiative by a lot of the left Democrats, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Markey from Massachusetts, who were the ones who just announced this platform. It's not programmatic yet, but it is kind of an initiative, and there are lots of mass grassroots organizations like this youth group called the Sunrise Organization that are supporting it, and they're saying that we are in a crisis like the Great Depression, and it requires massive government funding and support and a reorganization of the economy away from fossil fuels into renewables. All right.
Got it.
Okay.
So thank you for tying that. And I guess what I don't want to confuse people by going back and forth in different timelines. So I think what you're getting at is, and I've heard this talk, is the Green New Deal has maybe some unintended consequences that might occur, even though it's important. And it might be relevant to us just to go back to the old New Deal of 1930s, what it intended, and maybe some unintended consequences that occurred in home loans, small business loans, education, labor, etc. And those unintended consequences, what was the impact on society?
Okay.
In a nutshell.
What's that?
In a nutshell. If I couldn't make it any harder.
Hard to do. I know. Hard for me to do. The old, professor standing in front of his class lecturing, and I know that I have a tendency to do that. But in a nutshell, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president. There was a mass an election which he swept office, and the Democrats swept the Congress. The irony of this great electoral victory is that it put in charge of the Congress the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, as they were called for up until the 1980s. And the Dixiecrats actually ran Congress when they were once the Democrats became the majority, because they were the ones with the seniority. They took, we know from what just happened with the 2018 election, that when you're in the minority, particularly in the House of Representatives, you have no power. But in 1932, that's what happened. They went from having no power to having all the power. And these Dixiecrats were the architects and the bastion, the main supporters of white supremacy, of Jim Crow, of the whole Jim Crow era.
If you think about it, which makes sense, right? Because who they are, where they were, and where they were fronting up. I'm so glad that you're covering this, because if we understand our history correctly, we could have probably avoided what you just described in 2018.
Well, the issue is that the New Deal was organized by the people around Franklin Roosevelt, his so-called brains trust, all of the executive branch of the government.
Advisors, his council.
They had to get everything past Congress. And so the Dixiecrats made sure that every piece of legislation did not attack or undermine Jim Crow white supremacy. Not only did they do that, but they also extended Jim Crow white supremacy to the rest of the country. So, for instance, Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act, which gave unions the right to bargain collectively and organize, all excluded agricultural workers and domestic servants. These two sectors of industry. 80% of African Americans in the South worked in those two sectors. So they excluded almost all Black working people from these two, fundamental rights. And what they did, in effect, was to create a new system of racial privilege, in which Social Security and access to industrial employment and to the rights of rights to organize were exclusively or almost exclusively for whites. And so that becomes a really, really critical. The same is true for the GI Bill, by the way, because at the end of the war, almost 90% of the veterans were white. And many of the African American and other non-white veterans had been given dishonorable discharges or less than honorable discharges, so they could not take advantage of the GI Bill. And
so how does that impact? So you oftentimes speak of the 1%, the 9%, and having a coalition, a strategic alliance, quote unquote allies. How does what happened then, right, and maybe in veiled language, affect what's happening today? Because you gave two good examples of the GI Bill, labor, and then of course we could also look at home loans, and how that impacted. So tie that together for us. What happened?
What it means is that for the 90%, for those of us who are working people, there's a fracture, there's a split, there's an inequality between two major sections, the white and the non-white parts of the working class. And so union membership came to be separated from the interests of unions came to be separated from the interests of workers as a whole. And so we get a split, and it's not only racial, it's all of those poor white working people who are not in unions.
Layered.
And so the union movement in this country, which was a strong backer of the Democratic Party and all of these reforms, had within it a contradiction, a conflict of interest between the two strata of the working class, and that weakens us. That weakens our ability to expand these supports. The social safety net.
Thank you for bringing it home, because that's kind of where, and we're going to get into the Green New Deal. When you say there was a fracture and a disconnect, it's still impacting today, isn't it? We don't seem to have we're fractured, we're disconnected, we don't have a coalition. And so the 1% continues their gains now more than ever. I think I saw an article last week that there's more inequity in the last century or a decade that there's been in history.
Yes.
You see that article?
Yes. And the question is, why? That becomes the question. Why is there such a concentration of wealth today when we have this tremendous reform movement that went on in the 30s and 40s, and this vast expansion of union representation? And what happened since then? And what I'm making the case for is to say that change, that whole set of reforms had an inherent flaw in it. And the inherent flaw was that it set up this conflict between the organized and the unorganized sections of the working class, with most African Americans being in the unorganized section, but also many white working people as well. And so the union movement gradually became more and more defensive, more and more bureaucratic, less and less able to expand its base. To include more and more people in this in this representation. And yeah, go ahead.
I think this is critical and really important, because really what you're describing is that when we are not careful and when we leave portions of society unrepresented in legislation, the consequences can be down generations and detrimental.
Yes, make a very good point, Robby. That is exactly what we're dealing with, because the union movement was at its peak in the late 40s and early 1950s, and it has been downhill ever since. So
it's really,
it's getting smaller and smaller and less powerful, and it seems to be. It's the definition of insanity. You keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And it's what's been happening is that the labor movement has become less and less able to fight for the things that working people need to protect themselves from this concentration of power and wealth.
Right.
And so we're left with the union movement and the labor movement as a whole are, and the working class as a whole have been separated from each other. And this comes back to this whole idea about solidarity, you see.
It does. And I'm glad, because we've discussed before kind of right to work in Georgia being a right to work state and the lack of protections.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that the folks maybe watching, who aren't as tied into politics and so on, understand when you say the labor union and unions itself, that's our bargaining ability. That's our ability to protect ourselves and to negotiate contracts for sub-communities that don't always have as much political power or protections.
Right, but unions have a stake in maintaining the status quo to a certain extent. Or they appear to have a stake in maintaining the status quo, and as long as they are not organizing the unorganized, they are not only not expanding, they're losing touch with all of those poor and working people that are not protected by union contracts.
And let's bring that in a direct
group. They begin to look like a privileged group.
Right. Or they become
working people. Huh?
Or it's possible that they also become a privileged group to a degree if they don't modify.
Yes, and but here's the other part of it is that unlike people who are in the elites, in the 10%, it hurts them. It hurts the unions.
Right.
So they don't have a real interest in it, but they're caught. They're caught in this bureaucratic, system in which they have legal requirements to represent, everybody who's in a workplace. They need to have workers who are pay dues, for instance, and they also have a stake in maintaining private health insurance, for instance, because their corporate bosses are the ones who are providing the health insurance. So for years, the unions did not support most of the unions. Let me put it that way, because there's a lot of unions, and there's millions of people involved. But many unions did not support universal health insurance.
And I don't want us to get lost in the weeds, David, because we have folks. So we got to bring it back. We got to bring it back to a very concentrated, simple example for everyone and anyone to relate and understand. Let's bring it home to Atlanta. Okay, our largest airline. I think they're a good example of this, and I'll kind of throw out some info, and you You place it together and tell me where it's at. So everyone knows who the largest airline in Atlanta is. So I'm not even going to say the name because we don't need to get sued. But that being said, their pilots are unionized, and their pilots are predominantly Caucasian males.
Right.
And their flight attendants are not unionized, and they are predominantly females, predominantly white, then followed by Black, followed by sub-minority communities. Okay. Now, I believe their mechanics are maybe unionized, and I'll have to check on that, which is interesting because their mechanics are predominantly white males. Now, who's not unionized is everybody below wing. So in essence, below wing would be cleaners, security contracts, subcontracted caterers, people below wing on the ground, the folks who do this with the lights when you come in. And interestingly enough, those people are predominantly Black in the city of Atlanta. Yeah. So tie in what you're describing, that what occurred to the consequences of history and what occurs in legislation, whether it's veiled legislation or clear legislation, which is why I think Ms. Tamara reads those bills so people can be aware, every show has consequences today. And that description of the world of Atlanta's largest airline is fascinating. What do you think when you hear that breakdown? And how did that occur? Is it tied to history? Is it tied to what you described?
Well, yes. Now, of course, you have to keep in mind that since the 1940s, there's 60 years of history.
Well, that's one generation, though. If you think about it, that's one young person, one person who may have died young. We're one generation away from the legislation that was passed then and the consequences of it today. Yeah.
But and I agree with what you're saying, that I don't think we need to worry about Delta Airlines suing us for this conversation. We're talking about using Delta as an example of what
you're hiring the attorney if it happens. Since you said today.
We do still have free speech protections here. The fact that the airlines are predominantly white, workers of the airlines are predominantly white, is not an accident. It is part of what has been the tradition of unions in this country, which is that they organize only the skilled workers. Okay. And in the middle of the 1930s, when all of this mass movement was going on, there was a growing awareness that the semi-skilled and unskilled workers, as they're called, we really are not, who work on factory assembly lines and
trade workers with their hands,
who do not have a set of skills that can be controlled. In other words, by a small group, by training and all of these other ways. They began to organize, and they broke with the old craft unions, the American Federation of Labor, to organize the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And that name, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was to say that we are organizing industry-wide, not just the skilled workers, but all the workers in one industry. So the unions that developed were the United Auto Workers. It wasn't just the skilled auto workers, it was all of the auto workers, the ones who worked on the assembly line, as well as the skilled machinists and all of these other folks, electricians and that kind of thing. So that was the difference between the two. But within the CIO, within the Congress of Industrial Organizations, one of the things that happened was that the hierarchy of skilled versus unskilled workers remained intact within the union. So it was very hard for workers on the assembly line to actually get the training that they needed to become machinists and electricians and all of these all of these tool and die makers and all of these other skilled jobs. And generally speaking, the skilled jobs were white and usually non-immigrants. So that's one of the reasons why the labor movement. In other words, there was a fracture in solidarity there. And
just a comment. I want to get us on track. There's a lot of specific information. So right now, Mr. Mayor is writing that a commentator wrote, Ms. Hopkins, that the Green New Deal is a Green Party platform that has been altered to fit Democratic Party politics. It's not the same as FDR's deal. So that being said, David, hold on a second, because you give a lot of specific, but we've got to keep it on track back to this larger picture. In essence, what you described, and I kind of asked you and you didn't answer, and I want you to answer. I'd appreciate if you answered. The consequences of what occurred when we have non-represented communities in legislation that's passed today. We're looking at Atlanta's largest airline. The majority of their pilots, which you described as a skilled labor workset, are predominantly Caucasian males. The majority of their attendants, who earn the second largest salary besides the mechanics again, predominantly Caucasian males, are the attendants, predominantly Caucasian, followed by African-American, followed by subcommunities. Below wing is predominantly African-American, and they earn the least. Bring it home, David, tie it. Don't give me specifics, tie it. What happened in the, simply.
The tie-in is that this system of racial privilege, of preferential access to skilled, high-paying, and less vulnerable jobs is part and parcel of the way that the New Deal was structured, back in the 30s and 40s and into the 1950s. And it ended up, it pulled everybody up during this period, but it also had the disadvantage of separating out, of actually creating greater gaps, greater.
We understand how it pulls everybody up when the consequences of what I just described today, of what is considered to be one of the best employers in Atlanta, because that's where people are not, we're lost. And I want to bring this up because I saw an article, and we'll get to the New Deal, the Green New Deal. I saw an article about Ocasio, and it's discussing reparations. And a lot of my African-American comrades, friends, colleagues are really upset. They're like, Ocasio is about to ruin reparations for African-Americans. And there's a lot of spaces that it will say, come to this event, if you're Black and concerned about this, come. And I see nothing wrong with that. I want to make that clear. I see people saying support Black businesses. I see nothing wrong with that, because there's a norm, and then there's outside of the norm. So you have to do that to equalize. At least that's my opinion. But I also don't understand how, if we have those spaces, we as allies, colleagues, strategic alliances can support if we don't have the information, because we're not allowed in that space. And so I'm tying something together here. When you're bringing up the history and you're saying it brought everyone up, I want us to be real clear, even if we disagree. How did it bring everyone up if we're looking at one of the Atlanta's best employers and it is so racially divided? And I agree with you that there's a complication in that people in a secondary position of privilege receive a benefit that becomes a trap to some degree. But let's break it down in the simpler terms and look at the larger picture, because it's real difficult to hear that it brought everyone up when those are the consequences today, 60 days later. Because that's not everyone coming up.
Well, the point I'm making is that the social safety net that the New Deal introduced in the 1930s and into the 1940s had the effect of protecting working people, and gradually it expanded to wider and wider numbers of working people. All right,
that's important. Like some working people, because look, below wing are not protected. In fact, their wages
union. That's union representation. That's different from the social safety net. All right.
Okay.
Of Social Security and unemployment insurance and all of these other measures that were introduced. All right.
Okay.
But what point that I'm making is that the working people who are not unionized and not skilled, that's two different categories, all right? But the working people who were not unionized and not skilled did get a little bit of support and benefits. But the gap between them and the skilled and unionized grew. So you see what I'm saying here? It's not simply that one group benefited and the other group didn't. Both groups did. It's just that the top group benefited a lot more, so that the gap between the two, let's say between their income and their security and all of these other things, actually got wider.
And we don't know.
Got some protections, even though the people in the unorganized, non-white, and unskilled categories got some improvement in their conditions. It created a wider gap between them and the skilled, unionized, et cetera, so that
right. I would agree.
For decades, for instance, and still to this day, generally speaking, union membership has meant that you get private health insurance. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In the absence of any other form of insurance, in other words, not having national health insurance, which in fact they tried to the FDR and Truman in the middle 40s tried to introduce, they were defeated by the Dixiecrats. Okay, and so the increasingly in health insurance became a privilege of unionism, and in the 1940s and 50s, that was overwhelmingly meant white working class, skilled white working class males, and people who were in the big industries like auto and rubber and steel. And Tamara is reminding me that the New Deal, the Green New Deal, comes from the Green Party, not from these Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
David, we need to read this comment. Stacey Hopkins wrote on another page, so until we address the white supremacy and the excesses of capitalism system, there will be inequities in policy brought forth by anyone. Right. It doesn't matter if Black people of color are in those spaces or not. And having Black people of color representation doesn't mean we come up if we are complying and or enforcing laws and policies based on white supremacy. That's an interesting point. David, I want to address what you're saying because you brought up about 5 different topics. But that being said, it looks like Egberto's here. Hey, Egberto.
Hey, Robby, David, how you guys doing?
Hey, give me 1 minute and then it's all you. So, David, we're going to come back after Egberto's update on all national and global. And I just wanted to make sure that we come back to not unionized folks and non-unionized folks and everyone coming up or everyone getting a little better and where we're at today, because we're going to differ on that. And I want to go into it just a little bit. Egberto, it's you.
Yeah, before I go into the national thing that I wanted to talk about, I wanted to commend that discussion that I was listening to. And Robby, I want to commend you for that analysis that is so very important, and you brought it to the fold. The understanding that even when we're talking about progressive issues or when we're talking about union issues, that we still see that distinction on who benefits. It still turns out that the people of color still within that framework are the ones left at the bottom. And that is not it is until people bring it out. What happened is they treat unionized people as a monolith, and there is a hierarchy even within the union structure. And so I just want to commend you for breaking that out, and for David on starting to kind of break down how white supremacy comes into that. But I think I think now, especially with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez out there talking the issues that she's talking about, that what you brought up, Robby, is so important, because we still have that problem that come, and even with this Green New Deal, it could still happen that, well, with all these great things happening, there's still a whole lot of folks that are left behind because.
And that's really where I want to tie it together. So thank you, because really until we get on the same page about this as a community, right, as a community collective, we're not going to be able to really support each other.
Exactly.
That's the bottom line. They're going to be able to divide us and break us down, and we're going to fight for the scraps. And that's not going to work. That's what we've been doing this whole time.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
And to tie that in with what I really wanted to talk about, because you even gave me another angle to look at it at, and it goes like this. New York, I mean, Amazon was getting but in subsidies and giveaways,
they were
$3
getting
billion.
it. You said it right. They are getting it.
Right. $3 billion from New York. That $3 billion, instead of giving them giveaways, could have been going into the teachers and all these other issues. But no, they were going to give $3 billion to a guy who has $160 billion in the bank. Now,
right.
That said, I wanted to show that people power really, really works. But here's the thing that I wanted to talk about. The people that are now attacking the failure of this deal are liberals, well, to put it specifically, neoliberals, who are attacking Ocasio-Cortez for helping bring this deal down. When you talk about go ahead, I'm sorry.
Egberto, for those people, again, I'm the layperson here. What's a neoliberal? What's the difference?
A neoliberal is a person that that pretty much they come across as being socially progressive, etc., but they still follow the deep capitalist domain. They still follow the imperialist domain. So if you take a look at the policies of even Obama in the latter stages, even Clinton in the latter stages, they did the same amount of bombing. They did the same amount of United States first. That's sort of a thing. So
and these people can even be a little more dangerous because we're viewing them without a discerning eye. But
as part of the reform movement. So
yes.
the hidden assumption of a lot of these folks who are liberals, who were in control of the Democratic Party and now are still basically in control of the Democratic Party, is that we can make these changes under capitalism. In other words, that private property and these great concentrations of wealth do not have to be broken up in order to create, to address, like, for instance, climate crisis.
Right.
May not even be aware.
That is really, really critically important for understanding. I thank you, Egberto, for highlighting that. That is a fundamental difference between the left and the neoliberal,
exactly,
moderate left, is that they're really okay. Go ahead. Because I want to go someplace further with that whole.
After Egberto's offer, when he's done with his point, but because these folks may not even be aware of their own line of thinking, and sometimes without that understanding, we screw ourselves, to lack of a better word. Egberto, go ahead.
Yes, exactly. Because now what we see is I noticed that you're going to talk about the Green New Deal, and before I go, I just wanted to say, if you take a look at what the neoliberals, in effect, David and Robby, are doing, is you hear Nancy Pelosi says, well, that is aspirational. When it comes to Medicare for all, she says that is aspirational. Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and all these folks are in there saying, absolutely not. This is what we are fighting for. And that is where the battle within the Democratic Party. And to put it bluntly, I want to take that battle outside the Democratic Party, because I do think now we have Republican allies who realize that that the entire establishment itself, the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment, are both neoliberal in again, we're not talking about the two sides of the party, but the establishment themselves. And what I call them are the two rails of a track. And here it goes. You have a track that the train rides on. There's a left track and there's a right track. The only thing we know about that track is that they're both going in the same direction. So we can fight about, oh, I'm left or I am right. If they're both going in the same direction, they're the same. So we have to start making that distinction as progressives, just like Ocasio-Cortez and other leaders in New York did to force the capitulation of Amazon. We have to force the capitulation of those who don't want Medicare for all. We have to force the capitulation of those who don't want the Green New Deal, and really work towards it. There's one other thing I want to go before I leave you, because you guys had a great discussion that I want to finish here.
You have to go. Stay on with us longer if you can.
Okay, that your discussion was entertaining for me and enlightening. I really enjoyed it completely. But let me tell you better. As it turns out, we have to get these coalitions together, because and we have to break from just the Democratic coalition, because it's not going to do it. Otherwise we're going to be fighting within ourselves for people that don't necessarily agree with us. You see? So I like where you were going with the discussion on breaking the barriers within the system itself, meaning going from the noting that the unions don't protect everybody equally, and that is something that we have to work towards. Number two, that we as progressives have to break ourselves away from the neoliberal policies, realizing that these tracks are going in the same direction, and just moving forward from there.
So go ahead.
Yeah, let me mention another thing. There's another metaphor. I like your railroad tracks, left and right track.
Yes.
But I would suggest that another metaphor that would be useful is the idea of a pendulum swinging from a fulcrum, and the fulcrum is up here and the pendulum is like this, and unless you actually change the fulcrum, all that's happening is that the pendulum is swinging from left to right, from left to right.
Exactly.
So what we need to do is to solve the problem of how we shift the fulcrum so that the entire system is actually moving, in the direction that we want it to go. And
I agree completely.
I do too.
Okay, so here's the thing. The thing is that to actually do that, we need to have a self-critical approach for us on the left as to why it is that we have been unable to move the fulcrum. The pendulum has swung to the left and then it swung back to the right, and the fulcrum hasn't changed. And that is where I think the issue of racial privilege becomes so critically important, because as long as that's the case, white working people have this view that they have a stake in the system, right? And they provide the mass base for all these reactionary policies where they see that it's a zero-sum game between them and working people of color. In other words, what I get, you don't get, and what you get is taking away from me. Instead of acting in solidarity, instead of thinking and acting as working people, in other words, to fight for the interests of the working class, they think and act as white people, right?
David, I'm going to step in because I want to ask you both something. And this is more for my own clarity. I'm going to take a personal selfish minute right now because I want to understand something. So when I look at a plantation, and the structure of a plantation and the hierarchy on it, you've got the field slaves, you've got house slaves, you've got a person overseeing the slaves in the field, right? An overseer. This is a different hierarchy. And the field slaves were the worst, to my understanding. The house slaves had it a little better, and the person watching the field slaves had it a little better. When I listen to you both, and maybe I'm the one who's wrong here. When I hear the breakdown of what's considered one of Atlanta's or Georgia's best employers, meaning the airline, the largest airline, and who is receiving privileges in that hierarchy, it's not equitable. And I'm not saying that it's a good system for everybody. There's harm to all of it. But I really think we need to acknowledge that, because there is a form of social currency. And there is, and it's something to be valuable. It's used in business. You know, a reputation is social currency, and the pigment of someone's skin and how people perceive them is social currency.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge this. So I need you both to answer very directly on this thing, and then we'll get into the Green New Deal, whatever you want to talk about. When you hear that breakdown of the airline, the people below wing, they're not unionized. They're on $7 an hour if you're lucky, $2 an hour if you're pushing wheelchairs, and tips if you're lucky. You know, they have no protections whatsoever. And now the machinists, folks, for the last decade have been trying to unionize them and the flight attendants, and they can't make traction because of the disconnect that you're talking about. So I want you both to give your thoughts on that, because this didn't come out of anywhere. It came out of history and what's happened. So go ahead, Egberto, and then
David. First of all, I just learned that breakdown from you. I would not have known that breakdown unless you had mentioned that. Now that I know that.
Airport. That's in every airport. You go to Miami, the poorest, lo más pobre, they're exactly what I described. That's because I used to travel all the airports.
Right, and you know it.
Yes. So go ahead.
Now here's the thing in knowing this now, and then you added another piece that is so very important, that others in the upper echelon or the higher hierarchy are trying to get those in this other lower hierarchy to unionize, and they're having problems of these guys to come in. That is yet another dilemma, and that dilemma comes in with the item of trust. Okay, it is about trust and enchained minds. Okay, and they work in tandem. First of all, enchained minds is the one where those are the bottoms manager come and say, hey, you don't want to do that. They don't want what's best for you. Stick with me. And they're still mental slaves. I always talk, if you see some of the things that I write about, I always talk about most people are still are slaves, and the new slavery is in fact the corporate class, right? Because what happens is they don't realize that they are working to hold the doors up for that small percentage. So it's still a mind enslaved. And the other thing is trust. And the trust comes from the people saying, well, why do they really want me now? What is in it for them to want me? So
but you're right. You can't trust someone who doesn't understand where you're coming from. Right. And that's why this conversation is so important to me, even if it's just an acknowledgement.
Right. Yeah. So, go ahead. I'm sorry, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit, because I'm not very quick on the uptake usually. And one of the things that I began to think about was the Airline Pilots Association, ALPA, which is their union, right? Let me make a few points about ALPA. For a long time, they were in a tremendously powerful position. But as airlines deregulated, there began to be, and even before that, like for instance, freight pilots who fly freight airplanes as opposed to passenger airplanes, pilots who fly planes of regional airlines, for instance. You know, they are all they don't have the top tier positions of the pilots who are on Delta Airlines or United or any of these, you know, where they're
legacy carriers. It's called legacy carriers.
Yeah. What did you say? Legacy?
It's called legacy carriers. The large, after deregulation, they're monopolies. Go ahead.
They're oligopolies or whatever. And so there are large numbers of pilots who are working for much, much lower wages. They don't have the protections and regulations that say, you know, if you're flying for 8 hours, you get 48 hours off, you know, all of these other arrangements. In other words, the union contracts have undermined the solidarity. They have different standards. This is what happened for UPS, for instance. You know, United Parcel Service. At a certain point, UPS was facing competition, and they wanted to lower their wages. And they said, "All right, anybody who comes in after this date is going to get a lower wage than the people who are already here. You see what that does? It sets up a conflict of interest between the two groups, the newer workers and the workers,
the legacy workers.
So the union, the corporations are slicing and dicing, dividing, separating us out, playing one group off against one another. The only solution to that, and at the core of that pitting of one group against the other, is primarily the race issue, and secondarily the gender issue. So that is as somebody, Doug is saying, my father was one of the first wave of pilots hired by Delta after World War II. He took leave for a car wreck in 19. He was number 17 in seniority. He had lived. Had he lived, he would have been number 1 senior pilot in the last 4 years of his flying career. I was raised on Delta. He's making the point about how seniority works.
Right.
Now, here's the thing: seniority also has a double edge to it.
Let's hold on, David. It is 7 minutes to the end of this. You got to bring it back. We got to come back. If you want to go through seniority, do it in 1 minute and then bring it right back, because we need 3 minutes for the end of the Green New Deal. So go ahead.
Let's talk about the climate crisis.
Do your seniority in 1 minute. Then we're going back to Egberto, because we're tying this in. This is a really important conversation. I want it back, not to the freight airlines. We're talking about a corporation. This corporation is spending ridiculous amounts of money to keep the unions out of the flight attendants. This is like a workforce of 23,000 flight attendants, okay? The pilots have a hierarchy on it. They're protected. Alpha, you brought them up. We're not bringing up freight right now. They're not involved. They're involved to a certain degree, but not in this discussion. And then we have the below wing. The below wing has no protection whatsoever. It's a safety factor. The separate flight attendant unions were discussing this, how they're being used for political pawns. Egberto, you probably know about this, AFA. 23,000 flight attendants, and below wing, that's our caterers, that's our security, our cleaners, all impacting national security. And we absolutely have to, if we're going to come together, acknowledge that the people below wing have no protections and they're earning no money. And that's a huge difference between the people above wing, the flight attendants, the mechanics, the pilots, who are privileged. So Egberto, I want you to kind of go back, and then we'll wrap up with the New Deal. And that really matters in terms of inclusion. But go ahead, Egberto. Okay,
yeah, real quick, in less than 1 minute. I think that just the way you articulated it is excellent. And I think the solution to that really is 2 things that we spoke about, and that is starting to develop trust. We're going to have trust officers in the 2, when I say trust officers, I mean the ones who are going to be the liaisons to do that at the 2 levels. They're going to have to build it first, in my humble opinion, at the grassroots. In other words, this is before we talk about building the unions or fighting Delta about unions or no unions. They have to fight among, or they're going to have to fight among themselves, not fight, but discuss among themselves, so that they can go as a unit to demand the unions. Otherwise, the airline company is going to do what they know how to do, just like he explained with the UPS feature, and that is keeping them apart by making some feel more privileged over the others. And there's one thing human beings like, and that is somehow to feel privileged. And that's my little thing.
And what I'm saying here is that when I'm bringing in all of these other pilots that are around, is to say that it doesn't help the pilots to have what you're calling the below wing people not organized. It actually weakens them. It undermines their status the same way. And the UPS workers actually fought, to not have this 2-tier contract. So
Egberto, you have to go. Are you okay?
I'm okay.
You're okay. Okay. But see, David, here's the thing. You're right to a degree. It undermines the pilots. But just like that plantation overseer, just like the house slave, just like the person watching the people on the field, the pilots have privilege that nobody else has. They are protected by contract. They make the most money. They have a representative when they get into trouble. They can't be walked off property just like that. They will be paid. So we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that, because we cannot build coalition without acknowledging that. If you see me suffering here and you are doing better and you don't acknowledge what's happening to me, I will never trust you. And that's why these people cannot get a union below wing. That's why the corporation is very effective in spending money, and we have an at-risk airport. Do you know, in the last 3 years, about 30 guns went through the Atlanta airport? It was in the news. It was in the news. I'm going to send you an article. That is dangerous for our entire country. No one talks about it because our media is compromised. But David, do you see that? Because it's very important for people like
you. What I'm saying, Robby, is not disagreeing with you. What I'm saying is that there is an argument, a case to be made to those elite pilots that, and they can tell you this, because they're all 60 years old, 55, 60, 65 years old. They know that their conditions have deteriorated over the last decade, 2 decades, because because of the fact that they don't act in solidarity. You can.
The majority of the pilots, let me explain this. The majority of the pilots, and I'm very familiar with the corporation that we're speaking about, have multiple homes, multiple vacation homes, and a lot of toys. Let me tell you, there's not one person below wing that can say the same thing. And I hear what you're saying, David, but again, you have to acknowledge. I'm not disagreeing with you about that. I'm just saying that if you look at these guys, if you ask them, are you better off than you were 20 years ago? I would say that most of them would say no. Yes. Go ahead, Egberto.
So I'm just trying to say that we have to look at the ways in which privilege actually has hidden costs, as well as what you are calling benefits. That's the distinction that I'm making. If we don't appeal to people on the basis of their of solidarity, of their interests as working people, then all we're appealing to them to, I agree with you that it takes trust, but all that we're appealing to them to is some kind of moral, moral suasion. And in fact, we're leaving off the table when we do that.
It's 11:59. We've got to wrap up. Egberto, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to say in 10 seconds. I think that what we have to do is what David speaks about. We have to inculcate that in the minds of the pilots, because like I said before, privilege is a nice feeling. And like Robby just said, they feel very privileged, and they don't necessarily feel, you may know that it affects them, but they don't know that. They don't feel that affection. So I think
it's not just that they feel it, they are privileged. The people pushing the wheelchairs are making $2 an hour in tips. And the numbers are below wing. If you're talking about coalition, the numbers are below wing. We have to acknowledge that.
And that's why it may be a very nice feeling to have those 2 homes, but if you're increasingly vulnerable because the corporations have increasing power and increasing ability to undermine
regulation, they are protected by contract.
Robby, those 2 homes don't matter if the plane blows up in the middle of the air and you're dead. Okay,
but here's the problem. That is true.
We're dealing with, and
they're David,
very frightened now.
David, that is true. But if we look at the actions, if we look at the actions of people, just as Robby says, it is not rational. The support for Donald Trump is not rational. None of these actions are rational. So what she's talking about is the irrational act of these people. And what I am saying then is we have to get through the irrational act of them. In other words, you can talk completely and entirely about the plane blowing up. They don't see that because the planes are not blowing up. You can talk about they are getting more stressed, but they don't see that because you know what? Right now, you know what the corporation tells them? The corporation tells them that they can keep their privilege as long as we keep those underwing people underwing, unprotected. And that is why when we talk about trust, you are right, David, in saying that that they lose when those guys to the bottom lose. But it's no good for you to say that if they don't know that. It is for you to tell them that, because they're, you get it?
Egberto, I agree with you. We're not having a disagreement.
I know, we're not.
We're actually having the conversation that we need to have. I mean, what Robby is saying is there are two things that need to go on. The people below wing have to organize, and we have to support them as much as possible. Yeah. And the people below wing need to also have a conversation with the pilots and the flight attendants and the machinists and those folks to say, look, if you don't organize us, if you don't act in solidarity with us, not that you organize us, but that you act in solidarity with us, it's going to hurt you.
Can I say something for 15 seconds? For 15 seconds, and it goes like this. One of the issues with liberals, right, is that we many times, or progressives, know the answers. We know the answers. The problem is that in knowing the answers and in our high-mindedness, we don't talk to the core of people, or the carnality of people. And that is what I think drives it here. And that is where we have to get to the carnality of pilots, in my humble opinion. And sorry for taking up that time.
No, you're good. I'm going to wrap up. I think you both made wonderful points. And I'm just going to end it here. We'll get to the Green New Deal next week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. In terms of this, please understand that we will never be able to make coalitions if the people who are in mass numbers don't believe that their situations, their lives are being recognized and acknowledged. You cannot describe someone else's challenge without inherently understanding what's happening to people in mass. And until that's acknowledged first, we can't hear the second. So I appreciate you all being willing to have these very difficult discussions. Obviously, it's obvious everyone cares about this. Thank you. Be safe. Hopefully no planes will blow up and we won't get sued and any of that. But you guys want to close out? This is quite a show without Miss Tamara. We need Miss Tamara back. Look what happens when she leaves. That's it.
Thank you so kindly for being here. This was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed listening to both of you earlier on.
Thank you, Robby, and thank you, Egberto.